Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Vincent Bevins. He's the author of The Jakarta Method, Washington's Anti-Communist Crusade, and the mass murder program that shaped our world. Vincent, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. So I want to start in a very generalized way with you, which is, can you explain the origin and actual meaning of the term third world and how it sets the stage for this really incredible and very disheartening story that you've told here?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to start, and that's why I think it's really helpful in the book to start that way. So I start right after the end of World War II. So in 1945, the United States emerges from that war as by far the most powerful country in the world. It's often forgotten. It's often sort of portrayed that the Cold War is a contest of equals, but the United States is by far, in a way, the most powerful. And the United States and the former imperialist countries, or still imperialist countries at the time, of Western Europe are the first world. Then there's the second world, which was Moscow and the areas that it's controlling directly, basically the Soviet Union and Central Europe. Then at the end of the 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s, you have the emergence of something called the third world. And it's not even a category as much as it is a movement. It's a self-conscious desire among the peoples of the formerly colonized Black and brown countries of the globe to come together and take their place on the world stage. So it is not at all derogatory as it is now, largely because of the racist use of that term by English speakers over the last 50, 60 years. It was meant to signify third world as in the third act, or the final completion of the global order. And so this was, as I said, a movement among the peoples of the formerly colonized world to take their rightful place alongside the first and second world. And as I learned reporting this book, talking to a lot of the people that lived through this moment, they thought it was going to happen.
Yeah, that's really one of the most arresting things about this book. So we'll get into why it didn't. And I'll start by actually framing another very big, very important frame of the book. In popular discourse in the United States, when we talk about the Cold War, and even when we specifically talk about this or that example of whether it be, something as all-consuming as Vietnam or a CIA coup in this or that place, the sort of even like the left narrative is very important, but it's just sort of like a catalog of misdeeds, and we need that catalog of misdeeds.
Yeah.
But sometimes it isn't necessarily, it's contextualized, but it's contextualized as, just sort of basic stuff, which is true enough. Like, US imperialism is aggressive and bad, and if there is any type of redistributive project in any way on the periphery, it has been crushed. And I think that still very much persists into 2020. This is not historical in that sense.
You can point to exceptions, but they prove the rule.
Right, exactly. I mean, in the main. And then on the flip side, there's the kind of, these mistakes were made, but the real story of the Cold War was that was that you could create Apple in a garage. That's why it was won. That's why we have the world we're in.
Right.
I think, your story is, and I'm not in any way denigrating the heroism of people who documented, whether it was Chile or East Timor or Congo or anywhere, the enormous importance of the work of that type of work as presented in the West. But I think what you do, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you say, not only is the second kind of dominant fictitious narrative that it's just like, oh, well, that was a mistake, but the main story of the Cold War is a story of innovation versus bureaucracy, or even just that it was like this kind of, it was an endless catalog of misdeeds, but it was much more focused and systemic. And you talk about Indonesia and Brazil as these very specific jumping off points. And I guess I'll stop in a second, but the point I'm trying to make is like Guatemala, Iran, Greece, they're definitely part of this story. But there's a reason why in the mid-60s, these two vital places become a kind of horrifying roadmap for how the United States responds to the third world and how, in fact, they win the Cold War.
Yeah, I think they are the most effective, right? And so, I don't really come and say this outright, but you can sort of trace a narrative You can trace a line of regime change strategies from the beginning of the CIA and Iran 1953, Guatemala 54 to the 60s, and sort of watch a young empire grow, if you want to use that word, or a young hegemon learn how not to do imperialism or whatever word you think is appropriate. And yeah, I think Indonesia or in Brazil are not only the cases where the largest number of human beings are involved. More human beings are involved that ever lived under Soviet communism combined. So it's just Indonesia, Brazil, and the countries that they directly flip into the authoritarian capitalist camp is far more than the entirety of the Second World. But I also think I like the word catalog used, right? Because it can be really hard. Like a lot of the left discourse around the Cold War seems to be like making sure you have the list of every single bad thing that happened.
Right.
And there's almost something intrinsically impossible about fitting that giant list into the narrative that we have, right? Like, what do you do with that like giant list, right? Like, it just goes on and on and on, and it doesn't fit into the story that we're told. So I think one of the things that I try to do, who knows if I do it successfully, is to prove that not only is the second narrative wrong, that these were just things that happened and there were some mistakes that were made because we made alliances against the evil Russians. It was not only that wrong to claim that they didn't matter or that they were sort of incidental to the main action. They were the main action, right, and they were constitutive of the order we live in. But not only that, that these were interconnected techniques and interconnected movements, often trading personnel, actual US officials, or officials that met in one of the many anti-communist groups that were very active around in the world in the 20th century. They learned not only what failed, and I think in Iran and Guatemala we can get into this more, they learned sort of, if you're really obvious and you don't build at least some part of the some organic support within the society, it's going to be an unstable regime. And then they learned what really worked. And you know, I didn't want to focus my life on what turns to be the most terrifying and horrible tactic that did work. But the one that I focus on this book is the disappearance of large members of the opposition. So either leftists or accused leftists that are a real threat or a perceived threat to the construction of an authoritarian capitalist system. So in 1965, 66 in Indonesia, they kill approximately 1 million innocent civilians. And then in 1966, you have the importation, let's say, of disappearance into Central America. And you can trace, you know, sometimes we have to be, sometimes the coincidences are quite suggestive. Sometimes we have direct links. But I think it really only makes sense to see this as one big thing. And I think seeing it as one big thing makes it a lot easier to fit into the narrative than having a list of 95 times the CIA screwed over a left-leaning or a country or somebody that stood up to the United States. I think
right,
viewing this as its own essential part of the way that the Cold War was won helps us to resolve, I think, that false binary you rightly have drawn.
So let's build those links. What did they learn from Guatemala and Iran? Which, you know, superficially in the history books, I mean, sadly for the cause of democracy and development in the third world, those coups were successful.
Yeah, and they were seen as, they were seen as successes.
Yeah, so maybe talk about, you complicate that, but maybe talk about why, you know, we'll just start there. Guatemala and Iran, what happens? What did they learn from them?
So in Iran 1953, you have the first victory carried out by this new clandestine operation formed by the new hegemon. The CIA has been trying since 1947-8 to take on the Second World, and they fail repeatedly. They can't crack the Soviet bloc. The actual armed communist parties that run that part of the world know what they're doing, and they catch them over and over. Then they turn to what as we said has been called the Third World at the time. And Iran, they're sort of goaded into it by the British at first because of long-standing British imperialism in the region and British oil interests. But anti-communism is also used to get the Americans going, to sort of convince them they have to do it. And Iran 53 is seen as a huge success and a vindication even of the CIA as an entity. Guatemala 1904, another big success. Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, we should remember, was not lying when he said that all he wanted was to bring Guatemala from feudalism into capitalism. Like, that he really did want to just do the kind of land reform that U.S. officials thought was a good idea in countries that we actually want to develop, like South Korea and Japan. And now I think we should turn to Indonesia, because in 1955, President Sukarno, who's the founding father, sort of the George Washington figure of this very large and very important Southeast Asian nation, has the Bandung Conference, which is really the sort of formalization of the Third World Project. So leaders representing about half the world's peoples come together. This is one of two reasons the CIA trains its sights on Indonesia. Another is that the Communist Party is doing better and better in democratic and fair elections. So in 1958, they tried to do Guatemala 54 on Indonesia. They tried to replicate the same kind of operation that worked very well on Arbenz against, to break up Indonesia basically into pieces, or at least to smash the central government, which they thought was too left-leaning. It did not work. They failed spectacularly. They were embarrassed. They were caught. An American pilot named Alan Pope crashed into an island. And so the Indonesian left, which had been saying for years and years, I think the United States is not a trustworthy hegemon. I think they're going to be imperialist like the other white people were. They were proved right. Arbenz, it's often forgotten, or the entire thing is forgotten, but Arbenz sort of gave up, because in Central America in 1954, it was not unusual to hear that the CIA, or at least the Marines, were coming for you. And he thought the jig was up. He was not. There was like a fake bombing campaign that was supposed to scare him into quitting, and he quit. The Indonesians didn't quit. This big country, they fought back. The army was very effective. They were very committed to the Indonesian Revolution. And this American, for some reason, crash lands into the island. So they changed tactics entirely, right? So from 1958 to 1964, you have tactics being applied to the Indonesian military, which are very similar to what is happening with the Brazilian military, and a longer lasting relationship with Latin American militaries. So instead of fighting the Indonesian military head on, they bring them to Kansas, pay them very well to live there, treat them, let them have fun in America, train them in sort of what is U.S. Military-led, the ideology of the military leading a third world country into modernity. And it is that training which ultimately leads to the far more consequential, far more horrible, and far more long-lasting success in 1965, which is the coup which wipes out the world's third largest communist party, and then leads to a very long-lasting and stable dictatorship. And something very similar happened in 1964 in Brazil. The same kinds of military officers that had been trained also very closely by the United States military. And again, in 1964, they didn't have to kill a lot of people to take power. But the commonality that was between the two countries is that the military itself really believed in this sort of anti-communist American-led world order that they were going to march their respective countries towards. And these became, there's various terms that are used for it in literature, like sort of either like sub-imperialist entities or police states or active allies. So Brazil starts agitating around South America to flip 3 other countries to the anti-communist camp. So Uruguay, Bolivia, Chile. Indonesia invades East Timor on anti-communist grounds, or using anti-communism as a justification. The Philippines, very soon after, we don't see, there's a lot of back and forth, we don't have direct evidence, but the dictatorship in the Philippines has started in a very similar way. And then, like I said, the most horrible tactic, which is the mass murder of people through disappearance, is proved to be incredibly effective, because if your mother or brother or party comrade disappears, but you're not sure if they're dead yet, the human response naturally is to believe that your friend is probably the one that's alive, or your son is the one that's alive. And that really stops potential uprisings against the military, who have all these people in jail, and terrifies the rest of the population into keeping their mouth shut. And so it wasn't always in this exact way. It wasn't always disappearance. It wasn't always that the CIA gave lists to the local militaries of who they needed to murder. But I found throughout the long Cold War, 1945 to 2000 or so, there were 20 countries in which U.S. allied carried out the intentional mass murder of leftists or accused leftists in the construction of this authoritarian capitalist project. Like, it was, like you said, it wasn't just something that they did and they shouldn't have done. Without doing it, they would not have been able to sustain the governments that they created.
So I want you to really elaborate on that, because this is very important, and I think it also connects with, and feel free to move in any direction you want, but the version of globalization, even the kind of soft, fun branded one that we have in the 90s, that we're actually still living in. I mean, I get that there's all this, like, sure, there's right-wing populist, whatever, but at the end of the day, we still live in an American-led global economy that plays by a certain set of very narrowly tailored market rules. And this is inseparable from the process that you outline. And again, just as another example, if you ever criticize Milton Friedman or one of those economists for going and advising Pinochet while he's massacring people, the response is always, that's so unfair. It's like a menu. Milton Friedman would totally disagree with cutting people's stomachs open and throwing them out of airplanes.
Right.
That's not the part he liked. The part he liked was privatizing the post office, or
Right.
whatever. And of course, again, I think the traditional response to that is to say that's kind of ludicrous. But what you've put together is much deeper, and you can weave in how the Jakarta method becomes Operation Condor, that literally the reordering of the map is what facilitates these capitalist policies, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you could have constructed a lot of Friedman-esque neoliberal nations in the third world without the mass murder of leftists, but the world that we live in, it happened through the mass murder of leftists. And I think even if it were possible without that, the fact that it happened this way deeply shaped the nature of globalization that we got. And I think the type of globalization we got is a really good phrase, right? Because there was not only one way for the world to connect, right? The third world movement had its own idea of globalization. There was different iterations of globalization in human history. There's one really good historian, Adorn Westad, who wrote a history of the Cold War, and he's not a radical. He's a fairly mainstream, widely respected historian. And he says in his book, actually, I think globalization is not the best name. I think the best name is Americanization. We live in the world that is created by the complete victory of the United States and the values that country has, which I think we live in such an Americanized world, we forget the weird bits about U.S. Identity and U.S. history. That's why I try to put out in the book, we are a Western European settler colony in North America, right? There has never been a point in U.S. history when there has not been some kind of militaristic expansion being underway on the part of some combination of the most wealthy classes and the military. And so South America and Southeast Asia are two of the areas where huge swaths of that part of the globe were flipped from either the non-aligned, neutral, soft socialist, or even possible Marxist group of nations into the firmly authoritarian capitalist group of the nations. And this is, as I said, this is a huge percentage of the world's population. And in some parts of the world now, you can really, really feel it. Like Brazil, like Bolsonaro's Brazil. Brazil right now is governed by a man who made his career saying that Operation Condor didn't kill enough leftists, and we need to kill 30,000 innocent people for Brazil to ever move forward. And then there's other parts of the world where it's more subtle, that all of Southeast Asia ended up being integrated into this
Asia,
ASEAN, an anti-communist bloc.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe in a different world that we had never that has nothing to do with ours, you could create this kind of Americanization without mass violence everywhere. But ours was created with mass violence. And in the case of Indonesia, if you had not killed 1 million members of the Communist Party, left another million in concentration camps, purely for their political beliefs, you would have not had that flip. It was very dependent on that violence. In Chile, you know, DINA, the new secret police set up by Pinochet, they were very proud of that they didn't have to kill that many people, right? They were very aware that this was constructive and effective violence. And quick, let us explain what the Jakarta method is.
So 1960, method.
Yeah, so because it leads right into Operation Condor, which you asked about. So in 1965, as I said, there's the mass murder in Indonesia. And then in 1966, you see the first time that there's disappearances in Latin America. I think that's very suggestive. I think some people that were working at the CIA office in Southeast Asia went to Guatemala that exact time. So it's very possible that this was direct import. And then when Allende takes office, and in a similar way to Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, the CIA, the White House knew that Allende was not going to fall into a sort of authoritarian Stalinist camp. They were explicitly worried about him because they thought that he would be successful and that would inspire the rest of the region to follow his example. So as he is governing and withstanding repeated waves of right-wing terror, like actual, definite, terrorism, you see one of the terror campaigns is to spray paint on the walls of the city, Jakarta is coming, or just Jakarta, or people that worked for Allende's government or were supporters of the government or were on the left would get postcards in the mail saying Jakarta is coming. And anybody who was paying attention to the Cold War at that time knew what that meant. It meant we're going to kill you, just like they killed those Indonesians. And in 1973, when on 9/11, 1973, when the coup succeeds, Jakarta does come. They kill thousands of people. And again, we know from Pinochet's inner circle that they were doing this to establish the solidity of the regime. And so then in 1975, as you have most of South America governed by US allied authoritarian capitalist regimes, they start to think, well, what happens if some of the people that we want to kill escape across the border? And they form an international mass murder network. The US supplies kind of like the like pre-internet technology, which allows them to trade information. And then in the late 70s, and so Operation Condor member countries kill nearly 100,000 people in the high five figures. And then in Guatemala and the rest of Central America in the late 70s, as these countries become a problem for US hegemony, as they seem to be threatening the order as the United States wants it shaped, Operation Condor nations and the United States train Central American death squads. In Latin America, I found more evidence that they discussed Plan Jakarta in the Guatemalan context, in Spain with Argentine death squads. That is not as like strongly sourced as the stuff in Chile and Brazil, but this they learn from Indonesia. It migrates down to Brazil and Chile at the same time, because in Brazil, at the exact same time that they're having this Jakarta is coming campaign, you have behind the scenes the development of Operação Jakarta. And then this moves up throughout South America and into Central America. Now, the word Jakarta is something I use because it allows me to tie together the tactic. I don't always use the word. It's not, it's not as linear as as a book must always be. But yeah, like I said, by the end, all these projects work. So not only were the South American countries looking to Indonesia to think, oh, that's a tactic that works. They were looking and saying, oh, we can get away with it. If we do that, the United States government will play defense for us. They will defend us in the international stage. They will shower us with aid and foreign investment that we'll be able to take for ourselves and keep from the population. And that's exactly what happened. In all of these cases, these projects were successful, right? Vietnam was one case where we didn't win. That's why we know a lot about it. It was this huge gaping wound in U.S. hegemony for a decade. But, up and down Central and South America and throughout the rest of Southeast Asia, in some form or another, this authoritarian capitalism won. Like I said, in 20 countries, it meant mass murder intentionally.
What about, I want to get to how this plays out in the present world, but can you talk specifically about, I know more about this in Latin America, one of the most disturbing things when I was looking much more extensively at Brazil to kind of understand the context of all the coverage we were doing, particularly around the political imprisonment of Lula, was, the military dictatorship and so on. And somebody pointed out to me, they said, even this sort of like reputation that not, of course, yeah, relatively speaking, certainly in Indonesia, the Brazilian secret forces did not kill that many people.
No.
But they were like, look, just as there was, actual genocides, really, like in Guatemala in the 80s against indigenous populations,
Right.
when the Brazilian military or Brazilian secret services, or just even allowed the sort of local landowners to kill indigenous Brazilians indiscriminately, this stuff isn't even cataloged. And of course, and obviously it echoes so much today, even with, obviously Bolsonaro's waging a war across Brazil with COVID, and one can only imagine, we don't even have to imagine all the effects of it, but even, adding the indigenous dimension to that with like just a completely novel virus, there's no context for it, for protecting it. So before I go off on too much of a tangent, can you talk specifically about how indigenous communities, certainly in Latin America, might also apply to Indonesia, I don't know, were cataloged and talked about in this process as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're really right to point out that huge gap in the Brazilian narrative. So like the narrative on the Brazilian right is usually like, well, we only killed 400 people, which, yeah, they intentionally murdered for political reasons way less people than Argentina, for example. But if you look at what happened in the Amazon and the way that they tore across that region, it ended up ending the lives of huge parts of the indigenous population of Brazil. And this was, part of the very project, right? I mean, the history of the Western Hemisphere, from Canada down to the, Patagonia, is this history of white settler colonialism establishing, integrating, creating Western European speaking countries, integrating them into the global order, and, making the indigenous population get out of the way, either by killing them or integrating small amounts or just displacing. And so the Brazilian elite that was allowed to hold on to power in 1964, because 1964 didn't really change social relations, it stopped them from changing, right? The elite that was allowed, that remained in feudal control of the Amazon, had an even, they already had carte blanche basically to rip apart their territories as they wanted, but that carte was even more blanche in the dictatorship. But I think, and that's still the people that, if you go to the Amazon now, that's still the cause of the violence. It's still the feudal control over the land by a small group of white, often like tracing their ownership back to the Portuguese landowners. And I don't count, in my book, I don't count those deaths in the as the type of intentional anti-communist mass murder programs that I sort of talk about very closely. And I say that not to say that they matter less. I'm just trying to, I want to make clear how narrow the focus is, and how much even bigger the picture is if you want to take another step back, and I hope others do. Because a lot of people will be like, well, what about, how does this compare to communism? How many, and like, well, right. I think the terms of those debate are dumb in the first place, but usually those numbers are talking about like everyone that died from malnutrition or some kind of mistake made by the government. And in my case, it's really just intentional murder. Now, when we get back up into Central America, you had these two things become one, right? When you got back into Guatemala, especially Guatemala was the worst case, as I don't even know which wave it was, fourth or fifth wave of guerrilla movements attempting to overthrow the remnants of the 1954 coup. One of these guerrilla movements believed that it would be successful by engaging directly with the indigenous. Now, this guerrilla group barely made any inroads with the indigenous at all. In a lot of cases, they met them once. But this was enough for the, of course, inherently, historically deep-seated racism of the Guatemalan ruling class to say, oh, certain indigenous populations are inherently racially communist, which means they can be and must be destroyed. And I spent a lot of time in one of the villages in the highlands where this happened. And the reason I was able to speak to these people is because this was one case where they didn't kill everyone. You know, there was a lot of cases where they really, like, no one survived. But the community now is not, you know, it's very obvious that their community was destroyed and they've barely recovered. As I say in the book, like the only revenue they get is from sending their children to work in the United States illegally. And then in the United States, that's where their children learn Spanish, right? Because they're not Spanish speakers, they are Mayans. And it was precisely because of this centuries-old anti-Indigenous racism that it was seen as okay, not only in Guatemala, but in the United States, to wipe out 200 to 250,000 people, but because somebody said, oh yeah, that type of Indigenous person is a communist. So I think that it's really important to link the long history of settler colonialism and genocide in the Western Hemisphere with this particular set of tactics and motivations for violence between 1945 and 1990, which is the Cold War. But it's, you know, this is all part of a much longer thing. It doesn't just start in 45, it doesn't end in 1990, it takes different forms. And in the Cold War, it's communism. But there's often been different reasons to make sure that the indigenous people get off the land or work for the white person in charge.
Let's just talk let's take the last chunk here to talk about today. And we'll end, I don't know if it's exactly a hopeful note, but we'll end by talking about the world view, the vision that the people who pioneered the Third World movement had. I also would recommend Vijay Prasad's People's History of the Third World. It's also a great resource for this stuff. I always want to plug that book. It's a great book. But before we do that, how is this stuff playing out today? And what are the kind of ongoing legacies of it? I mean, I guess there's the very obvious of like a Bolsonaro presidency. One of the reasons that I have such a huge sympathy towards the pink tide, whatever its various complexities and differences and whatever. I mean, one, massive poverty reduction. And secondly, I think the most systemic attempt in modern politics to really replicate something like this, the attempt to have some type of autonomy and delivery on the periphery, which they did, in fact, achieve a lot of, I think, in that 2000 to 2016 period, whether it be Lula or Chavez or, Mujica or a variety of other leaders. That project, and it's very fashionable on the left in the United States to talk about the inherent contradictions of it, and that's fine. But there was certainly a U.S. Interest in undermining those governments without any doubt. And I think actually some folks sort of, maybe because we were all burned out of listening to Noam Chomsky on alternative radio, we might have kind of overcorrected with, yes, there's a lot of other variables in the world besides U.S. foreign policy, but particularly when you're talking about Latin America, it probably is still the, at least on a power level, prime variable. So how does this, if we take as a given that the world we're in today is not just an organic thing, it wasn't just like, well, there was just this competition between the Soviet Union and the United States and both sides made mistakes and blah, blah, blah. But, the US had the Apple computer in the garage, so we won. I read your book actually, and I pair it with Quinn Slobodian's Globalists, where he kind of talks about the bureaucratic formation of things like the WTO and debunks the idea of libertarians as being like anti-government. They're certainly not anti-bureaucracy when it comes to writing the rules of the road for capital. That's sort of the point of the book. And then you're literally talking about the actual infrastructure of death, frankly, that stop this potential historical progression. So, yeah, I mean, in 2020, in any direction you want to go, whether it's U.S. efforts, the Venezuela component of it, the leadership that we're seeing resurgence. I mean, Duterte, does he rhyme with Marcos? What's happening in Indonesia? Any of it? How is this playing out today? Yeah,
I think the pink tide is, I think what you said was really interesting there. I mean, I I started my career as a journalist in Venezuela 2007, 2008. And I think, again, you're right to point to like a false binary between, oh, it's all because of internal contradictions in the pink tide, or the United States is all powerful and they control everything. I think that the United States is not all powerful. They don't control everything. And I think that the pink tide had contradictions, just like every nation that has ever existed has had contradictions. The United States has had contradictions at every point that it's been the most powerful nation in humanity. What I think is a nice way to resolve that false binary is to realize that U.S. hegemony does not require the constant and effective implementation of regime change whenever they want, because we know that's not how it works. And also, if you live in those countries that were going through the pink tide, you understand that you don't need to have the effective and automatic implementation of regime change to totally warp the conditions under which you operate, right? So I think that U.S. hegemony, just like every other sort of period of world historical time, sort of shapes the possibilities and sort of warps, what is allowed and what is not allowed. And at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, if you are seen as favored by the United States, you get a lot of chances to make mistakes. If you are seen as a threat, you usually get to make one big mistake and then, you're out. And
or maybe the U.S. is facilitating that mistake as well.
Oh, no, exactly.
And
they know, and the countries, like I said, Venezuela. So Venezuela is a country where I think number one, Chavez and Maduro have made lots of mistakes. Maduro in a much, with much more catastrophic results. But also, you have to place the entire trajectory in the wake of coup attempts in 2002, in which Chavez believes he's going to be murdered. And then when I'm living in Venezuela in 2007, 2008, even though at that point it seems relatively stable, right? Even though at that point he's extremely popular, it doesn't seem like the United States is trying to do anything. The Venezuelan political class, supporters of Chavez, they know, the United States may not know the history of Guatemala and, the U.S., your average New York Times reader may not know so much about what happened in Guatemala and Chile, but the Venezuelan left did. So you have this entire political class believing, well, if we screw up again, or maybe if we let ourselves be too open to outside intervention, they could not only overthrow us, but kill me and everybody that I know, right? And this was
question.
And when you have this fear, and whether or not they were right, whether or not that plan was ever on the cards, you understood why they were so afraid. And this kind of fear totally changes all the political calculations that any kind of a movement, socialist or otherwise, is going to make. Like, it's really hard for U.S. citizens to understand how distorting it is to think that this other big country at any time could come and kill you. And this comes up in the book, like in 1954, Che Guevara is in Guatemala City during the coup carried out against Arbenz, and he comes to the conclusion that, like, oh, you'll never be able to do any kind of self-throw revolution, moderate, socialist, communist, in the democratic context, because the United States will take advantage of that to destroy you. And, like, again, we can argue as to whether or not he was 100% right, or whether that was led to good things or bad things in Cuba, but you understood why he came to that conclusion.
Well, and I think it is mostly right. Even to the extent that, and I think you explicitly said it earlier. Places that we allowed to not necessarily play by as stringent neoliberal rules would be a place like South Korea, as an example, that was already fully identified and with the U.S. camp. And I'll just say, I always say this, but I think Venezuela and Brazil really prove damned if you do, damned if you don't, because, the Workers' Party is, whatever else one says about it, and I'm obviously an ardent defender, but there's no question about their democratic credentials. There's just zero question about that. Yeah, and they were drummed out in this clearly illegitimate U.S.-backed process and an impeachment that, there's not even sort of any controversy about anymore. And then in Venezuela,
it's over. Yeah.
Yeah. It is what it is. And whatever else one says about Venezuela, and I admit to being extremely sympathetic, whatever, obviously there's criticisms that can be leveled everywhere. But I think it's going to be another lesson, frankly, in what has resiliency. I mean, you know, if Lula can bring tens of millions out of prison, out of poverty, respect democracy, cut deals, becomes a political prisoner, and then, you know, Maduro is still surviving in spite of, I mean, certainly we know I would suspect those efforts are ongoing in one form or another, but we certainly know in the Trump era that they're quite overt. So I think that's important information. But what was the third world vision? Like, what would the world look like if a Sukarno could have kept leading?
Yeah, the third world vision was pretty simple. They wanted to undo the colonial relationship that had been established over hundreds of years of imperialism. So they came onto the world stage understanding that as a result of their insertion into the imperialist capitalist system, their job was to export raw materials for cheap, not develop their population, not develop industry, and just send their stuff that they pull out of the ground to the first world. They thought that that was clearly a result of colonialism, and that once they got together, they'd be able to force a change of the rules. They thought that they were the majority. They thought once colonialism ends, this colonial relationship where we just give them stuff, you know, raw materials to use in their advanced economies, that's going to be over. Often in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and this was not only in the third world, but you know, socialism was much more popular even in the West than we remember. Often, the anti-colonial struggle was often tied together with some version of a softening of capitalism or rejection of capitalism overall. And I think this relates to what you said. I think it was interesting about damned if you do, damned if you don't, because you can point to any given project in the third world and point to real mistakes that this or that leader made. I mean, Sukarno did overextend himself in territorial disputes, and the economy was not doing well in 1965. You know, Chavez did this, Maduro did this, Morales did this. But then if you really step back and take a global look, which I try to in this book, you can ask, okay, well, what country ever in the post-colonial period successfully had a social democratic project in the global South? I don't think there's one, right? I think Brazil and Morales were the last two, and they fell apart for reasons. You know, one is a more overt coup. One is, you know, the elites using the political establishment to get rid of Lula. So there's two conclusions you can either draw from this. Either everyone in the black and brown world is bad at politics, and so they screw up.
Right.
Or there's something about this era of U.S. hegemony from 1945 to 2020, which stacks the cards against this kind of a movement. And I think to not believe that the second hypothesis is at least a little true is ignorant, if not racist, right? Like,
absolutely.
Yeah, you know, it's a lot of coincidences, right? And again, in every case, yes, X leader made this mistake, that leader did make this mistake, but and I think like often a mistake on the left or anywhere really is not to think as globally as this. A lot of people think like, oh, if we come together in my, like, you know, commune or my little government and we create the perfect recipe, we're finally going to get it.
Right.
But it's often not about, you know, this tiny little recipe you've created in your one kitchen. It's the entire conditions in which you're trying to make this, you know, to bake this cake or whatever this metaphor is that I'm constructing. And for some reason, from 1945 to 2020, every social democratic, anti-hegemonic project in the global South has failed. Now, why did this book come out now, and why is this such a good moment to examine all of this stuff? Is because I think that U.S. hegemony is shifting, or perhaps, you know, wobbling a bit. That doesn't mean that things will necessarily get better. Things could definitely get worse, but I think it's definitely a good moment to think about what really this all meant, because I don't think that moment is going to last forever. And so, yeah, I looking at this made me really doubly conscious of always looking at the big global perspective, because, you know, it can't be that everybody's bad at running a country. And, you know,
I mean, I just want to say again, and we'll keep stipulating they all made their mistakes, but not only, but, you know, if you look at the whole sweep of this movement, from Sukarno to Lula to Morales to Michael Manley, I mean, there's a lot of significant political talent here.
Yeah,
Like, there's a lot of capacity, and I mean, I agree with you completely. The idea, if you can't see contextually what has undermined these projects, you're just not understanding how the world works, which is a diplomatic way of saying what you said before. It could also
and it, it also doesn't have to be that some guy from the United States with CIA on his hat like does the thing.
Right.
It's a case like Morales. He was allowed to be successful for a very, very long time, because he was doing so well, like I said. But then when you make your big mistake, if you're sort of in a counter-hegemonic position, that mistake is often to take advantage of very quickly, and then eventually you fall, right?
Or even if you're just in a normal cycle, like, because again, I don't think Morales made such an extraordinary mistake, but if the if the ground starts to shift even a little bit, and I think also it's, one thing that is notable about the last couple of years is it definitely does seem that the sort of pretend niceties of liberal openness, people are feeling much less of a need to kind of pretend to observe those norms. And there's, the idea of like, yeah, I don't really like that guy in power, but the truth is that we still have like our cattle ranch at the Brazilian border and we're fine, has somehow turned in the last couple of years into like, we have the giant fucking Bible and we're going back to the 1980s and we're out of our minds. And again, even there, it's, although I think this pink tide U.S. aggression began with Bush in certain ways, and certainly Obama administration was a participant in it, but it's hard to not see. I mean, Trump is a permission giver for that as well in that context.
Yeah, no, Trump is really interesting because he wants U.S. power, but he rejects the international liberal order, right? He insists on the U.S.'s right to take whatever it wants, but also refuses to acknowledge that there is like sort of a global system that he's a part of. It's a very strange, contradictory moment, which I think has caused kind of a crisis of liberalism, right? Like a crisis in mainstream thought in the English language. I think like people are kind of like running around with their heads cut off, not knowing what to make of all this. And I don't think his project itself is sustainable. And I think a lot of when I was covering Southeast Asia, in the run-up to deciding to write this book, it was clear to like a lot of leaders in Southeast Asia that this is not a sustainable project. Trump was viewed as sort of like, okay, well, let's see where this goes. But
let's see how this plays out. This isn't exactly Lee Kuan Yew here.
Yeah.
Vincent Bevins, I really, really appreciate your time. The book is The Jakarta Method, Washington's Anti-Communist Crusade and the Mass Murder Program that Shaped Our World. You should read this book and buy it at an independent bookseller. I'll say that. Vincent, thanks so much for doing this. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
You just watched a Michael Brooks Show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.